Over to Europe now, where car makers including Volkswagen and BMW are scrambling to find alternative sources of vital parts that were made in Ukraine so far. From as far as China and Mexico, they could be sourced now. As Russia's invasion, it has halted assembly lines and broken complex chains in Ukraine. The hunt for new supplies is the latest challenge for auto industry, which is already reeling from soaring metal and energy prices. Supply chains have stalled by the pandemic and the shortage of semiconductor chips, and fighting in Ukraine has now disrupted output of wire harness. Well, this harness can bundle up to 5 kilometers of cables in average car. It's unique to each model. Vehicles cannot be built without them. And as a result, world's #2 automaker Volkswagen and rival BMW have cut output and temporarily closed some assembly lines. Mercedes-Benz has warned its production will be affected also. Volkswagen's premium brand Audi said entire Volkswagen Group is working to get major suppliers to relocate their Ukrainian wire harness production to other plants, or they may find alternative suppliers. That search includes Eastern Europe, North Africa, Mexico and possibly China. BMW also said it is in intensive talks with suppliers to find alternative sources for parts. While world #4 car maker Stellantis said it has already shifted its sourcing from Ukraine to elsewhere in Europe. And WION correspondent Rosie Burchard sent us this report from Brussels. Take a look at her story.
Manufacturers of cars are now reportedly struggling to access certain types of parts which are made in Ukraine and are critical to production. So particularly wire harness, that's one key car part which is usually, we understand, manufactured particularly in Western Ukraine, close to that border with Poland, close to the European Union, and therefore has in the past been easily accessible for those car manufacturers. Now we see those producers scrambling to try and find new ways and new places to produce those key parts. And of course, the car industry is one that's already been slowed down in the past year and more by shortages, by supply chain issues, by hikes in energy prices. We know, for example, that production has in the past been stalled here in Europe by shortages in semiconductors, the majority of which are produced in Asia. So this is an industry which has already been reeling with shortages and due to various issues in supply chains, only complicated now by this deadly conflict to which so far we don't see any end in sight.
And coming to India, here India and Sweden have had long-standing close ties, and according to Business Sweden, the ties are moving in the right direction. But what's the overall assessment of business environment now, especially in the light of Russia-Ukraine war and high crude prices? Now, to know all that, we are joined today by Mr. Larsson. He is CEO of Business Sweden. Good morning to you. First of all, how do you see India-Sweden business tie? In which direction are they going now?
I think you can look upon that in many different ways. I often see the world as right now driven by 3 megatrends. You would find the digitalization, where we now can get more data than ever, we can use more data than ever, we have better algorithms than ever to use that data and that connectivity to drive both productivity and efficiency in production, but also in getting people's lives better. In that field, I think we can collaborate quite a lot. We also have innovation as a driving force in the world economy right now. It's not anymore about just innovating faster, but a lot of the companies are now focusing in on redoing, innovating the way they innovate. And I think in that field as well, Sweden and India have a lot to share. And then thirdly, naturally, the third big mega trend that is affecting companies today is sustainability. Within sustainability, within innovation, within digitalization, I know that Swedish companies are pushing the boundaries, and Sweden as a country, even though it's so small, is in a leading position compared to all other nations.
Now we know about the Ukraine-Russia war that is going on, and how is it going to impact the global economies overall?
War, crisis are naturally, from a human perspective, disastrous. From my country's perspective, that is very close to Russia and very close to Ukraine. it is also a very sad reminder that the Cold War era has not disappeared with the 1900s, but actually live also in this 21st century. That's naturally very saddening. But having said that, I really hope that as long as the conflict and the war is contained to Ukraine and Russia, the effect on world economic development will be limited. Naturally, if there would be any other effects with conflicts, then we will have a totally different situation. So the world is a more insecure and a more nervous place today than it was only 2 weeks ago. And that affects the economic sentiment. But as long as it's only Russia and Ukraine, I see no reason to believe that conflict would affect the Swedish and Indian relationships or the big trade movements around the world. But it's very secondary, actually, economic issues when people are suffering and people are dying in the war.
What about the impact of Ukraine-Russia war on global economy as far as higher inflation and crude prices are concerned? They're both at record high levels now.
No, definitely. Inflation has come into the Western economies with a power that we maybe should have foreseen, but after 10 years of basically no inflation whatsoever, we may have been a bit unprepared for it to come. But naturally, with all these programs, from Gati Shakti over to Build Back Better, over to Next Generation EU, with all these public spending programs, it would almost be surprising if the inflation pressure wouldn't be higher. And on top of that, naturally, the energy prices that have gone up will add to that inflationary tendencies. So that naturally affects the world economy, and I think raises awareness among many central bankers, but also many finance ministries on how to balance the monetary and fiscal policy measures going forward. Then on the oil price, I think it's very, very difficult to say where it's going, because naturally the long-term demand for oil will come down sooner or later. And at the same time, now with the supply and the war in Ukraine and the sanctions against Russia, that will disturb the market as well. So short-sighted, naturally we need to be prepared for higher energy prices and energy shortages, not least in Europe. But on the long term, I'm fairly certain that oil prices will come down. Inflation, however, is a whole different matter, and it will be very interesting to see how countries and economies will kind of adapt to maybe more of a normally inflation situation than we've had the last 10 years. But there are a lot of questions, I think, that are still to be answered.
Again, the last question on Sweden-India business ties. Which direction are they moving, and are they going to be impacted by any of the disturbances which we have seen globally?
The Swedish-Indian ties are much stronger than both wars and inflationary pressure and macroeconomic situation can affect. So I really think that kind of the ties, not least that were tied now between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Löfven a few years back, those ties and those different kind of agreements will carry us also into the future, and developing areas such as life science and tech development and space and defense and you name it, and solutions to the climate crisis that we see ahead. So I really think that the ties between our countries those ties are so strong that I don't see any risk of them being weakened by what is happening right now.
Well, thank you for joining us this morning and getting us all these details and important perspective on this important issue. Thank you once again. WION, now available in your country. Download the app and get all the news on the move.